Hello and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday. It's easy to forget in the political hue and cry what this is really all about. The toll of COVID deaths is now closing in on 150,000. 150,000, the entire population of Blackpool. And alongside the many families who have suffered bereavement, millions have endured the pain of not being able to comfort a loved one during lockdown. That's why, I guess, a nation which is usually slow to anger seems suffused with rage this morning. The very people who urged us to be responsible and to sacrifice for the good of the nation seem to have shown no such restraint themselves. Instead, they partied. And worse, when they were called out, it appears that they were ready to tell us anything except the truth. And for once, the post-Watergate cliché may be apposite. It's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. This morning, as Omicron threatens to turn back the clock on the fight against coronavirus, we'll ask if Plan B will work and explore with our guests what all this means for Boris Johnson and his administration. In a moment, I'll speak to the man who has the unenviable task of defending his boss, the Prime Minister, after a horrendously damaging week for the government. That's Education Secretary Nadhim Zahawi, also able to give us an important update on where we are on Omicron, given his former job as Vaccines Minister. Conservative MPs are restless, given the parlous state of Number 10 and its inhabitants' reputation right now. There's talk of a major revolt over the new COVID restrictions and even rumours about the beginning of the end of the Boris Johnson era. I'll talk to the influential backbencher Steve Baker. We'll get Labour's take on things from the Party Chair Annaliese Dodds. And we'll get an all-important update from Johannesburg, with all eyes on the data coming from South Africa as we try to work out just how dangerous Omicron will be in the UK. I'll talk to Government Advisor Barry Schoub. So, we'll find out what it might mean for the UK and get a sense of the state of COVID in Scotland from infectious diseases expert Debbie Bogart from the University of Edinburgh. And we'll also talk about the impact of COVID on education, following the disturbing new research that shows young people from the north are particularly hard hit. I'm talking to York University Professor Kate Pickett. But first, I'm joined by the Secretary of State for Education, Nadhim Zahawi. Good morning, Mr. Zahawi.
Good morning, Trevor.
Can we start with the numbers, please? How many people do we know are infected by Omicron and how many are being hospitalised at this moment?
So what we know, hence the concern, is that 1/3 of infections now in London are Omicron. We think that obviously the reported tests are indicating about 1,600 cases, but of course the number of infections in the community would be a multiple of that, up to 10 times that. We know that it is highly infectious, so the doubling rate is between 2 and 3 days. So very quickly, Omicron will be the dominant variant in the United Kingdom and probably the rest of the world. We've seen this movie before. We saw it with Kent variant, then of course Delta. One of the obviously advantages we have is we've got a very large capacity for testing and of course genome sequencing, hence why we know so much. We also know, and I can confirm to you this morning, that there are cases in hospital with Omicron. We've been able to test people who are in hospital over the past 2 weeks. And so there is a lag to hospitalisation, but the risk of a highly infectious variant, even if it were, as many people quite rightly think, because some of the data from South Africa is suggesting that, it is less severe. Even if that is true, well, if you get to 1 million infections, because you understand exponential growth. So if by the end of the month you're at 1 million, with 3 days later you're at 2 million. Yep. And if it's half as severe as Delta, let's say only 1% end up with serious infection and hospitalisation, that's still 10,000 people.
Still a big number.
It's a huge number.
You were the Vaccines Minister, and the government, to be honest, has played a great deal on your success on the rollout and pinned its strategy entirely on the success of vaccine. What do we know about the impact of the vaccines, first, second, and booster jab on Omicron?
So you're absolutely right. We've answered the first question. Is it more infectious? Yes. The second question, do the vaccines work? Well, we know now, and some data was published over the last 48 hours, that 2 doses of either Pfizer or AstraZeneca are not enough. They only protect to about 30%, AstraZeneca even less than that. But a booster does raise that protection back up to where we were when we got to equilibrium between vaccine efficacy and Delta. And we need to get back to that. So this is going to be a national endeavour. We need to vaccinate with a third jab, the booster jab, so important, all those people who become eligible, all adults, because it is now a race between the booster and that protection and the Omicron variant.
Well, you've already made the point, exponential growth can be astonishing. What are you going to do to boost the spread, the booster jab, as it were? We can't presumably carry on with the same process as we had before we discovered Omicron. The administration of boosters is going to have to be accelerated pretty dramatically. What's the plan?
So there is absolutely a plan, and the Prime Minister will be saying more on this. You will know that the NHS are already making preparations from Monday for the 30s, the 30-year-olds, to be able to come forward after their second jab, after 90 days, so 3 months after your second jab, to get your booster. We are mobilising the old team, the frontline, GPs, community pharmacies, military, across the board, volunteers. We're asking people to come forward and volunteer. You can go on and join the volunteering army on the National Volunteering Service website. It's really important. This is a race. Genuinely, I say.
You can increase the number of people who are putting jabs in arms, but what are you doing about providing more access? Essentially, we're up to whatever it is, 16 million or something like that in the boosters. Presumably, you've got to get into the 30 millions, the 40 millions very, very fast.
Yeah. So we're over 20 million already. And you're absolutely right. It is now a race to get all adults who are eligible for their booster jabs to be boosted as quickly as possible. And the Prime Minister will be saying more about this later today.
All right, look, the other side of this is what the Prime Minister's been saying, that you are imposing restrictions in order to slow the spread and give us time. On Tuesday, the Deputy Prime Minister was saying that there were no further coronavirus restrictions required beyond what you'd said last weekend. And the former Prime Minister, Theresa May, was cheered by Tory MPs when she said, we've got to learn to live with COVID. Now, within 24 hours, situations turn completely, and there are going to be new restrictions. First of all, what is it that happened in that 24 hours?
So let me just be clear. As Patrick Vallance said at the press conference, we are transitioning this virus from pandemic to endemic, but there are big bumps in the road, and this is a big bump, a huge bump in the road, in the sense that we now have a variant that is so infectious that it will dominate and, of course, exponentially grow. So back to what we were talking about. So let's do a mathematical exercise for a second. Right, you get to 1 million infections by, say, end of December. Right, 1% is 10,000 severe infections that could be in hospital. 3 days later, it's 2 million. Right, 3 days later, it's 4 million. Right, 3 days beyond that, it's 8 million. Right, that is the risk, that even if it's milder, say by 50% milder than Delta, the numbers are huge. It's a small percentage of a very large population. That is the big difference. So the reason we're taking these proportionate, I think, precautionary measures, the most significant of this, by the way, that scientists tell us, is the work from home. That will have the greatest impact on slowing down Omicron. So hence why we've had to take these measures. I think they are proportionate, they're precautionary. The really important thing is for the whole nation. This is going to be a national endeavour, Trevor, right? A national endeavour to boost the nation as quickly as possible so that we control Omicron and bring back that equilibrium that we had with the virus as we continue to protect the economy and, of course, on that journey towards endemic from pandemic status.
Is the move to vaccinate primary school children part of this race against the spread of Omicron?
So there's no plan at the moment to vaccinate primary school children for the reason that the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation is still looking at the evidence as to what level of protection that would offer those children. Of course, we vaccinate the 12 to 15-year-olds at pace. It's great to see, at school in East London the other day doing the pupils, but also managed to do some of the teachers and parents who hadn't even had their first or second jab. Really good. We're seeing it all over, Home Park in Plymouth, staying up till 2 a.m. vaccinating people. So the important thing is to boost the most vulnerable. That is absolutely the priority.
But surely the important thing is the most important thing, given what you said about the terrifying spread and all the rest of it, is to stop the spread of the infection. And SAGE scientists have warned that the children were the drivers of adult infection in the summer wave last year. So surely we need to do something about that.
So really excellent question, which is why we obviously begun, as soon as we had permission from the JCVI, to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds, because you saw a spike in secondary schools on that. If you think about exponential growth, which you and I just talked about, this is so infectious. The best way to slow it down is to keep people working from home, for example, keep adults apart. Mm-hmm. But at the same time is just protecting the economy, hence why it's proportionate. We're trying to do everything in these new measures to keep the economy open, keep it running, protect businesses, because that also does a lot of harm to people's health, mental health as well as physical health. The important thing is you want to protect the most vulnerable, because that ultimately, even if it's less severe, it will put the most vulnerable in hospital.
But surely one other thing that you ought to be thinking about here is mandatory vaccination.
I don't agree with that, and I tell you for why. We have very high levels of vaccine positivity in the UK, probably highest in the world. All the data suggests that, whether it's the ONS or other surveys, 90+% of all adults say they've looked at the information, they're protecting themselves, protecting their communities, protecting their loved ones. So to now play into the hands of the anti-vaxxers, by the way, I understand people who are hesitant, and it's right that we focus and give them information, but the anti-vaxxers will say, you see, that's why they're now doing this stuff. Actually, the right thing to do is share information and have this national endeavour now to really protect. It is a race, Trevor, and we've got to now drive hard for the next couple of weeks to protect the most vulnerable.
All right. Well, look, the success of that national endeavour depends to a large extent on the leadership of the government. So let's talk about leadership. 18 months ago, Dominic Cummings, Barnard Castle. 12 months ago, Prime Minister's aides, partying, and Prime Minister himself. By the way, who knows how many Christmas parties? 1, 2, 3. Prime Minister himself hosting a quiz night. Everybody's breaking the rules that you set for the rest of us. So let me repeat what I said to one of your cabinet colleagues earlier on this year. Why, when you tell us to show restraint, to be part of this national endeavour, should we pay the blindest bit of attention to you guys?
So the first to say on that is that actually the nation has been brilliant at following the guidelines. Brilliant.
That was before they knew what you guys had been up to.
All the time. Even yesterday, people were queuing up at vaccination sites, walk-in sites, or booking their booster jab. That's a great thing, and I am grateful to people doing that, and we thank them for that. On parties, the Cabinet Secretary has an investigation, and his investigation can take him anywhere to look at all parties. I have to say to you, you just mentioned the quiz night and that picture today. What do we see in that picture? We see a Prime Minister on a virtual quiz night for 10 to 15 minutes to thank his staff, who, by the way, had no choice but to come in every single day. Let me just finish this point, right? Sitting in his office with the two people who are closest working with him, no alcohol on the table, not drinking, right? on a Zoom call or a Teams call, on virtual call, respecting the lockdown rules. Many people would have had similar Zoom quiz nights around the country.
Yeah, and they would have been nicked for it. If I had done it,
hold on.
I would be in monster trouble.
But because you went on a virtual...
Why does he get to do it?
Because you went on a virtual...
he was sitting next to two people within social distancing.
They are in his office. They work with him.
And that was work, was it?
No, hold on a second. When all I'm saying to you is the Cabinet Secretary is going to investigate everything. But that picture, in many ways, I've had emails from constituents because the hype around parties that was going on in the last week and the week before, right, made it sound sort of completely different. And actually, I think people will look at that picture today, and the Daily Mirror has been leading the way on this, and will think, hold on a second, he's on a virtual call, no alcohol, thanking his staff for 10 minutes before he goes back to his work. Is that really a
Let's not get too
terrible
stuck
crime?
on the one photograph. Let us remember how this issue started over the last 2 weeks. It started with the allegation that there were parties and several days of the Prime Minister and other government spokespeople saying, oh, no, there were no parties. That's the problem, isn't it? It's not that, something might have happened, that could have happened in any office. It was that when the government was asked, did this happen, we were told point blank, they didn't happen until you've had to admit they did happen. In your own department, you fessed up straight away.
So let me talk about my department and then talk about your question. On your question, the Prime Minister said, to the best of his knowledge, there were no parties. He didn't attend any parties. He also said that the rules were followed, and you saw that in the picture today. It's a virtual Zoom call, not anything else. And I think the nation will understand that now, because the hype around it was these parties, where people were mixing and lots of drinks were flowing, is not there. As far as my department...
When you say the hype around it, are you saying they didn't happen?
No, I'm just saying to you...
You're not coming in here and telling me they didn't happen.
I am not. I'm saying that the Cabinet Secretary will investigate all those allegations. He can go anywhere with his investigation, and that will happen. And he'll report rapidly on this. As far as my department, when I found out that there was a gathering where people came together in the canteen who'd been working in the office because they couldn't work from home, where the previous Secretary of State wanted to thank them, then we apologised, because actually, upon reflection, in hindsight, it shouldn't have happened. But it's the right thing to do, is to come out and say, look, this is what happened. People were working at their desk. They brought their own drink in and were sitting at their desk, but then it was felt it's better to go to the canteen to maintain self-distancing, to thank them
Mr. Zahawi,
for their endeavour.
This is exactly my point. You did that, by contrast to your boss. And my question to you really, we've known each other for some time. My question to you is, do you feel any sense of shame that you have to sit at a cabinet table with people who seem willing to say anything and do anything other than to admit the truth, as you did within 24 hours?
So, again, I'm going to repeat, the Cabinet Secretary will look at any allegation. His investigation can go anywhere, and he'll report back. And then I will come back on this programme and be answerable for that report. But let's step back a second, right? I feel very proud that this Prime Minister actually set up the Vaccines Task Force, bought 400 million plus vaccines for the nation. We've got enough supply for the booster, which we now know, and if he hadn't made a decision to spend the money on the additional Pfizer doses, we would not have the booster campaign today.
But
I feel very proud we're the first country to open up and to maintain that opening of the economy. Keir Starmer wanted us not to open the economy. Imagine the damage that would have done to people's lives.
I'm going to let you say all of that, but let's be honest with each other. All of that may be true, but he has essentially squandered that credit, because now, when he asks people to do things, the doubt about whether we can trust his word is immense. Surely, even you must admit, this is not, irrespective of the politics of it and all that, this is getting in the way of tackling that terrifying threat that you have described earlier in this interview. We need to move fast, and every day that people cannot trust the Prime Minister, is costing lives. You must see that.
Well, as I was saying to you earlier, actually, if you look at the evidence, people have been very good at understanding how to protect themselves, their family and their community. They've been very good at following the rules, hence why we were able to reopen the economy and do it so successfully. We're now asking them again to be cautious, to be careful, proportionately,
and to trust you.
And to race towards the booster.
You.
Well, to trust their government that managed to deliver the most successful vaccination programme in history, and of course reopen the economy so rapidly. And by the way, spend 407 billion protecting jobs and livelihoods.
All right, let me give this one last go. They sent you out this morning with a brief, frankly, to defend the indefensible. Is it time to admit the Prime Minister, who you've supported all along, in, I think, the most honest and open way, is it time to admit that you supported him in part because he's an election winner, but he's now become a liability?
I don't agree with that. I worked very closely with Boris Johnson. I worked with him when I was Business and Industry Minister with the Vaccines Task Force, and then when he asked me to do the vaccination deployment programme. He works literally all hours to make sure we get through this pandemic. The number of decisions I've seen him make, including making sure we had enough vaccine, making sure we have the fastest vaccine deployment programme, and he will make sure again that the booster campaign is going to be a national endeavour. He is doing a serious job at a serious time for the nation. And actually, if you look at the hype that's been going on for 2 weeks around parties, I'd reverse the question and say, are the media, you said earlier, before we went on air, little things keep us busy in the media, right? Are you really getting a right balance here in terms of, Omicron is such an important variant that we have to deal with versus talking about a Zoom call where he was motivating his team who had to work every day without having to, they don't have the ability to work from home.
I've been counting. We spent the first 50 or 60% of this interview talking about Omicron.
You did.
So I'm not burying you with trivia. Look, let's deal with something that could be real. You could be back in here next Sunday after a Conservative defeat in the by-election at North Shropshire. Are you still going to be telling me in that situation that Boris Johnson is the right leader?
In North Shropshire?
No,
Neil Shastri,
after he loses.
Well, Neil Shastri-Hurst is a doctor who's been vaccinating people himself. He is an incredible asset to the political landscape in the United Kingdom, and I'm confident that the people of North Shropshire will see that and will actually support Neil Shastri-Hurst on Thursday, and he'll be returned as our member of Parliament. And if he doesn't, I will be back on your programme, but I am confident that actually when you look at what Neil Shastri-Hurst has done in his life, he is an excellent member of Parliament for North Shropshire.
And Boris Johnson? Still be.
Boris Johnson
right leader.
will be focusing on that national endeavour to boost the nation. It's a race against time.
Secretary of State, I should say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Trevor.
Now, I am filled with sorrow to see us squandering trust. The Conservative Party is in the wrong place. Not me, but withering criticism from one of its own and one of its most influential backbenchers. That is Steve Baker, the leading Brexiteer and Vice Chair of the group of Conservative MPs who are sceptical of COVID restrictions. He joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Baker. Next Tuesday, the House of Commons is going to vote on a new set of measures to restrict the spread of COVID. We've just been hearing from the Secretary of State. Are you going to support your government?
Well, I'm expecting 4 votes. I will vote against vaccine passports. I'll vote against extending a face mask mandate. I'll vote against mandatory vaccination as a condition of NHS employment. The 4th one is a slightly liberalising measure. I don't expect the House to divide. But yes, I will vote against. I think what we're doing now is creating a miserable dystopia into which we're going forward. And that's why today I'm announcing that I'll be relaunching Conservative Way Forward. We need to create a movement which actually says the Conservative Party needs to be what people traditionally have recognised as Conservative, that is in favour of freedom and personal responsibility. So I hope people will go to conservativewayforward.com and sign up as supporters, and they'll be the first to hear more.
Presumably you wouldn't be launching this if you didn't have some support. Do you have any idea how many members of Parliament will join you from the Conservative benches in voting against the government on Tuesday?
Well, The Spectator has run a list on this, and they've got 65 names on there. It's not absolutely clear to me that they'll all vote against. Some may abstain, but I know about half a dozen extra names. So it feels to me that it's going to be at least 60 people voting against. But of course, it's a foregone conclusion, because our useless opposition in name only will continue to support the government, however authoritarian they are. But, you know, really, this is a moment where every last one of us should, in good faith, start thinking about what it means to live with coronavirus like we live with flu, now that we're vaccinated, and what kind of society we want to live in the future. I want one which is free, which is prosperous, and which is joyful, in which young people can have a hope of a better future. And at the moment, we're not looking like we're going to deliver that. If we keep on panicking every time we get a variant, this disease will now be with us forever. There will be new variants. The vaccine continues to give a high degree of protection against serious illness and death. And I'm afraid we just do now need to get on with our lives.
We read this morning in the newspapers about dissent in the cabinet and the possibility that ministers may resign. What do you know about that? Do you anticipate ministerial resignations over these measures?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so far ministers have voted for a great many things that they don't like doing, and that's been one of the hallmarks of this period of the coronavirus. You know, we keep doing that which we hate, but saying we'd like to be doing something else. Well, I'm afraid sooner or later, if we're going to save the soul of the Conservative Party, we've got to actually do those things which we love to do, and that means being courageous and temperate and prudent and counting the cost of lockdowns and restrictions, rather than having this endless tunnel vision just on the disease. You know, we actually can't go on like this. Only the Conservative Party can provide good quality government that draws on the tradition of freedom and responsibility under the rule of law. And all the time we have minute and frequently changing rules governing our lives, so that we can't plan forward, whether it's for business or for pleasure. I'm afraid we're going to make enormous swathes of our economy uninvestable, and there'll be just the swathes which give our lives meaning. Things like being able to go on holiday, being able to go to hospitality venues. You know, we saw for a long time that weddings were in trouble. You know, these things really matter in our lives, and pretty soon we're going to have to start learning why it is that we've always believed in this country that freedom under the rule of law mattered. And that's really why I'm relaunching Conservative Way Forward. We've got to show that there is a movement for that frame of mind, because if we don't, the Conservative Party will continue to drift into authoritarianism, and I simply cannot stand idly by while that happens.
You referred in a newspaper article this morning to the Conservative Party essentially, and you've repeated it here, having lost its soul. Is that what the Johnson administration is doing, burying the Conservative soul as you understand it?
Well, at the moment, we're in a pretty bad shape. You know, Boris did promise us that he'd be, as he put it, a Brexity Hezzer, and that is what he's done. He's a highly interventionist Prime Minister. I think we did expect that. He had two really important jobs to do. He had to take us out of the European Union, albeit with the unfinished business of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and he had to make sure he beat Jeremy Corbyn. But I'm afraid I did expect him to spend quite a lot of money. But I think that the thing that's really changed now is we've used so much quantitative easing, that is money creation, to cover the enormous amount of borrowing the government has had to get us through COVID. I think now, as we go forward, we've got to be extremely careful to apply conservative principles to what we do, because the size of the state, the size of taxation, is now not consistent with conservative government. It would be, you know, fit for a Miliband government, and much as I'm on friendly terms with Ed Miliband, I didn't want to be in his party.
Mr. Baker, what's interesting about the way you talk about this is that you're not talking about it really as a partisan or even an economic question. You seem to be posing the issue as a moral one, and that in some way, where the Conservative Party is now is in some sense immoral, in a sense almost ethical or religious. Is that your belief?
Well, if I were to to put it to you as plainly as I can, surely life for each of us is a process of becoming. It's a process of becoming greater tomorrow than we were today. Not of comparing ourselves to other people, but comparing ourselves to what we were and trying to become better in some sense. Now, if life is a process of becoming, don't we deserve the dignity of choice as free human beings with something like a soul? And if you don't have any kind of spiritual belief, well, at least come up with something which gives you meaning as a freely choosing individual. I mean, where are we going to find meaning and purpose in our lives if we don't have choice and responsibility and this opportunity to grow? And so that's why I'm so very concerned that what is happening here is we're being treated by the government, by the public health establishment, as automata who can't manage to decide for themselves that it's a good idea to wear a mask in an enclosed space. I think we've all learned that now. I'm certainly capable of doing it freely, and I'm very sure that your viewers are capable of doing it too. And really, we do need to think very carefully now about what we wish to become. You know, in society, are relationships healthy when they're voluntary, or do they all need to be coerced?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the fundamental question.
The reason I frame this or raise this as a moral question is partly, as you said, it's to do with a question of individual choice, but morality also relates to leadership. And I want to ask you about the leadership that you have supported, of your party and of the government that you've supported. Boris Johnson this week, essentially, has been in a whole series of issues about whether he has told us the whole truth about payments for decoration of flats, the issue of, once again, of Christmas parties and so on. Do you think that this leadership remains the sort of, if I could put it this way, moral leadership that you can continue to support? Or has this Prime Minister reached the end of the road for you?
Well, I'm really clear that I want Boris Johnson to be a success. I'll never forget sitting next to him at a dinner. I can see it in my mind's eye now. And he started to talk about the condition and the prosperity of the British people in a way which was earnest and honest.
Yeah, but
real.
Forgive me if I may interrupt you.
That's the Boris Johnson I want to see.
Yeah, forgive me though. Boris Johnson's idea of success may not be exactly the same as yours. And what you seem to be saying here is that success is not just a matter of winning or getting through it or getting past the next scandal. It is also about what you believe and how you behave. So let me ask you again. Is Boris Johnson still the kind of leader behaving in the kind of way, displaying the kind of morals that you feel that the Conservative Party should still support?
I think right now the Prime Minister is in very great difficulty for the reasons that you're indicating. Any member of the public is going to rightly demand that politicians not only comply with the rules that they impose on other people, but that they're seen to comply with their spirit. And it's pretty obvious now that that hasn't happened, and that is a very bad position to be in. But let me be clear, Trevor, I've been down this road once before, which viewers will know, and I have absolutely no intention this time round of trying to remove a Prime Minister. I want to see Boris turn this situation around. I want to see him rescue his position. I want to see him go on to be a great success. But he's not going to do it by paying lip service to rules and being incautious about how his staff behave and comply with them. So, you know, we didn't make him Prime Minister for his meticulous attention to detail. But, you know, it is now a time for complete compliance with all rules.
So you're clear, he hasn't followed the rules. If he doesn't turn it around within, let's say, a few months, is it going to be time for him to go?
Well, Trevor, as I just said a moment ago, and I hope you will understand and your viewers will understand, I've been down this road before and I'm determined not to go down it again. The reason that I'm launching Conservative, or relaunching in the new year, Conservative Way Forward, is because I think we need to create a movement which says to Boris and the whole Conservative Party, we want to live in a society characterised by freedom under the rule of law and personal responsibility. That's really what I'm about.
Steve Baker, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
So it has, by any estimation, been a grim week for the Conservatives. And while Labour's now got a consistent lead in most polls, it's still fairly modest, especially given the government's travails. So why isn't the party making more impact? Well, let's talk now to the Labour Party's chair, Annaliese Dodds. Good morning, Ms. Dodds.
Good morning.
First of all, can we just be clear about one thing? This week, in that vote on the COVID strategy or COVID tactics, will you be supporting the government's Plan B?
We've consistently put public health over party politics. So yes, we will be, because we do need to protect public health.
It looks from what we've been reading, and indeed from what the Secretary of State said for Education said this morning, talking about the extraordinary exponential growth of Omicron, that they will have to go further. Will you support a Plan C, for example, a further lockdown?
Well, before any additional restrictions should even be contemplated, we've got to see government urgently taking a number of actions. They should be boosting the booster programme. We're far behind where we need to be. We haven't seen those retired staff being pulled back in, those volunteers being pulled back in for the booster like we saw initially. That's got to happen now. We need to see action on our schools. We've got less than half of the young people who should have been vaccinated by now actually having been vaccinated. The government doesn't seem to have any plan for ventilation in schools. All they're saying to teachers is just open the windows. We'll try doing that in December in lots of parts of our country. And of course, they haven't fixed sick pay either. So there's a huge amount the government must do urgently, and they must do that before they even contemplate looking at any additional restrictions. This is very urgent now.
So ventilation, a bigger drive for jabs for young people and so on. You wouldn't go any further at this point, for example, extending vaccine passports?
Well, look, we really need to get those other measures in place, because we know that ultimately the vaccine is the strongest barrier against this disease progressing, particularly with the Omicron variant there. And we've got to boost that booster programme. That's going to be the strongest defence. As you know, Trevor, we've got those plans that will be coming through around the vaccination of NHS staff. Now, actually, we want to see government working very, very hard, as the Welsh Labour government has done, actually, to make sure that NHS staff have all the information about the vaccine, that there's a really strong education and encouragement programme there. That will drive up uptake. If ultimately that doesn't get us far enough, then we will not oppose a passport scheme for those NHS staff. But really, government should be learning from what's worked elsewhere. And the Conservatives seem to be unwilling to do that, even though those education and encouragement programmes have been so successful in Labour-run Wales.
There's one estimate that says that the NHS could lose more than 100,000 staff because of mandatory vaccines. You would still insist that NHS staff were required to have vaccinations at some point if persuasion doesn't succeed?
Well, the government has set out a timetable of this beginning in April, so they've got a number of months to really focus on that education and encouragement. And, you know, this is not about remaking the wheel. As I said, they've got a very good example coming from Cardiff with the Welsh Labour government there, where they worked incredibly hard to get the message out, to combat disinformation, to make sure also the vaccination was very, very easy for NHS staff to take part in. And that drove up those levels. You know, they're significantly higher amongst NHS staff in Wales compared to in England. That ultimately is what should be focused on. But if it doesn't get us as far as it needs to, the evidence that we've seen suggests that mandatory vaccination for the NHS staff may have to still be on the table in April. So we're not going to be arguing against it for the sake of it.
All right, let's turn to politics. Do you have confidence in the proposed or the ongoing Cabinet Secretary investigation into Christmas parties and all of that?
Well, I wish it was into Christmas parties and all of that, because it isn't an investigation that will be looking into all of the different parties that we've seen evidence of. No more.
Well, actually, I think they announced yesterday that they were extending it.
Well, I am encouraged if they genuinely are, because until recently, the suggestion was it would only cover effectively one party. But frankly, of course, this is going even beyond number 10, because we have now heard that there have been social events which, for example, the former Education Secretary took part in. So we've got to have full transparency around that. You know, the Prime Minister must make sure that he is very open about everything that he knows. Just a few days ago, the Prime Minister suggested he knew nothing about any parties, and then he ordered an inquiry into one of them. This is a very strange set of affairs. And I think British people are really fed up with all of this chaos, with all of the sleaze that's engulfing the Prime Minister. He's got to get a grip now, and our country's facing massive challenges. They need a government that actually is adequate to face up to those challenges, rather than one that's just engulfed in sleaze.
Are you? Is it time for Labour to be calling for the Prime Minister to stand down at a time of national crisis? Wouldn't that be a non-partisan thing to do?
Well, obviously, I'm a Labour MP, so from a partisan point of view, now I'm working every day to try and get a new government in place, to try and get the Conservative government out. But when it comes to the Prime Minister's position, that's ultimately in the hands of the Conservative Party, and I do want them.
Yeah, but come on. You've been telling us how important this is for the country, that you're interested in the country rather than party. We have a leader that your own leader says is not fit for office. And this is not a party political thing. We need a Prime Minister who's going to lead us through this crisis. Surely, if you really believed that, you would be saying it is time for Boris Johnson to resign and allow somebody who can lead the country effectively to take the keys to number 10. So, is it time for Boris Johnson to stand down or not?
We've been very, very clear that he's unfit for office, but ultimately the resignation of a Conservative Prime Minister is in the hands of the Conservative Party, not the hands of the Labour Party. And what we've been urging week after week, month after month, is for this Conservative Party to get a grip, because for as long as it doesn't get a grip, working families in our country continue to pay the price.
Annaliese Dodds, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, the Omicron variant was first identified in South Africa, leading the UK to impose a controversial travel ban on several southern African countries. It means the UK is looking to data from South Africa to understand just how the variant will behave and whether it will lead to more hospitalisations and possibly more restrictions, therefore, here. So let's hear from Johannesburg. Let's try and get a sense of what we can learn from the real-world data there and to talk to the government COVID advisor there, Barry Schoub. Good morning again, Professor Schoub. Can you summarise for our viewers the impact of Omicron in your country thus far? How many infected, how many hospitalisations, and how many deaths?
Yeah, good morning, Trevor. Yeah, I think it's been a kind of a mixed bag in a way, because basically on the one hand, we've had a very rapid rising rate of infections. In fact, if you look at the epidemic curve, it's almost vertical, so steep is it going up. In fact, our doubling time at the moment is about 1 to 1.5 days. It's, in other words, every 1.5 days, we're doubling in numbers. So it's rapidly increasing. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, our hospitalization rates have not been that high. And also within hospitalized individuals, it's only about 15%, I think is the latest data we've got, of those hospitalized are actually either in ICU or in high care. So it looks so far that the clinical expression has been mild, but that could really be due to the fact that immunity in the country is high, either from natural immunity, from past infection, or from vaccination. So that's the kind of positive side. The rate of transmission is the negative side. And the one other negative that does appear to be quite apparent is that there's a lot of what we call vaccine escape. A lot of people that have been fully vaccinated are still getting infected. But fortunately, of that group, the great majority are mild. So that's a kind of a round overall picture where we are at the moment.
That's very helpful. The population in South Africa is, on average, much younger than the population here. And our Cabinet Minister, Secretary of State for Education, who I spoke to earlier in the programme, painted a picture of exponential growth of Omicron here, which at one level is pretty terrifying. And he said that even if it is milder, as you seem to be suggesting from the data in South Africa, we could still end up with a really large number of cases, bearing in mind that we have, many more older people. Is that something that we ought to be alarmed about?
Yeah, Trevor, I don't want to give the kind of wrong impression that the Omicron is causing milder disease. I think what we're seeing, there's a lot more mild disease, but that's, I think, because of immunity. It's very early days at this stage, and I don't think at this stage we can be confident in saying Omicron is a milder variant. We hope it's going to be, but I don't think we can say. And, if you look at the virus itself, virologically, to date, there's no real evidence to suggest that it will be milder. So you make a very good point. If there's a higher proportion of older individuals, it may well not express itself quite as much as we've seen, quite in the same way as we've seen in South Africa. But one thing I should point out, though, is that we are seeing more and more cases in younger individuals. In fact, even in young children, as young as 2 years of age, we've seen quite some serious cases. So we need to kind of take that into the balance as well.
So would your advice to us be, don't get ahead of yourself, treat this as being as serious potentially as Delta or any other variant we've encountered thus far?
I think we need to. I think we must avoid trivializing it. At this stage, we're still gathering information. We're hoping it's going to be a tamer virus, but we really cannot say so at this stage. So at the moment, we do need to treat it as seriously as Delta, with all the kind of precautions that we took for Delta. We can't let up on that at the moment.
Have you got any thoughts or any idea about how long before we'll get some hard enough data to be able to make, proper sense of how serious this thing really is?
Yeah, we are gathering data, in fact, day by day, week by week. So I would guess that certainly in the next couple of weeks, we should have a much better perspective on the virus. We must remember we've only had this virus for about 3 or 4 weeks. So it's still really early days. We're still in South Africa on the upward trajectory of our fourth wave. So we still need to kind of be cautious. Hopefully 3 or 4 weeks' time, we'll have a much better view of it.
So we may know something by the new year. Our government is saying, and I heard it again this morning from our minister, that there is evidence that the booster jab has a significant impact on the virulence of Omicron. Is that what you're seeing in South Africa?
Yes, I think the booster certainly will have a significant effect. It's only relative that there is vaccine escape. So obviously, the more we stimulate the immune system, we can kind of get a higher level of immunity to overcome this potential vaccine escape. In South Africa, we're not nearly as extensive in boosting as you are, for example, in the United Kingdom. So we wouldn't really be able to kind of give data at this stage on that.
Professor Schoub, thank you so much for your information. Valuable and fascinating, as ever.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you.
Well, let's get a sense of what all that could mean for the UK and just how bad things could be in Scotland, where the First Minister says there will be a tsunami of Omicron cases. I'm joined now by the infectious diseases expert, Professor Debbie Bogart from the University of Edinburgh. Good morning, Professor Bogart.
Good morning there.
Nicola Sturgeon's issued this warning. Can you quantify that? How bad could it be?
Well, I think the data that we have so far show this clear, what we've called already for 20 months or so, exponential growth of this new strain. So we have this strain only for less than 2 weeks. And if you see that this strain goes from 1% to 2% to 4% to 8% to 16%, that clearly shows an exponential growth. And the interesting thing here is that it takes all these little steps every 2 to 3 days. So if from today, this was Friday, so let's say today the amount of cases that is explained by Omicron is about 30%. We can be as high as 100% of all cases being explained by Omicron halfway this week. So it clearly shows that we can potentially face a tsunami of cases. So I fully agree with that.
What is your view about this discussion we've been having pretty much all morning about whether the symptoms are going to be milder out of this variant or not? Is what you're seeing telling you anything on that topic?
Well, I think everybody is saying we should be cautious, and I agree fully with that. We have a new variant that we know can infect people with pre-existing immunity through a recent infection by Delta, and also infect people that have been even double immunized. So, but we assume that that immunity that they have will protect them in part against severe disease. But also with Delta, we've seen we still have quite a significant amount of people in hospital. I think we're about 6,000 cases at the moment, isn't it, in hospital in the entire UK. So even if Omicron would be slightly milder, if this exponential growth keeps on continuing because a much larger proportion of the population is susceptible, we can ultimately face quite an overwhelming number of cases anyway in the hospital. So yeah, the good news is we might be either because the strain is perhaps causing milder illness or less severe cases, and we might be partially protected by our pre-existing immunity. If the doubling time and the number of cases keep on continuing like they're doing now, we might still reach very large numbers. And even if a small proportion of those require hospitalizations, we might get quickly overwhelmed. And I agree that we need to see how this all pans out in the coming weeks. But I don't think that if we really want to be ahead of the game, we have weeks to sit down and wait to see what's happening. So we probably need to act pretty fast to be ahead of the game.
So is it your view that what we need to do is to behave as though the NHS is likely to be overwhelmed by the combination of existing Delta cases plus what might happen out of Omicron? And if we're lucky, we won't have that, but we have to now behave as though that's the case.
Yeah, exactly. I think everybody heard the number of 1 million cases that could potentially or theory be reached by Christmas. And I think we all can feel that that's way too much and would way overwhelm the system, let alone have a lot of people being put into isolation, not being able to celebrate Christmas. We have already measures in place. We have already immunity in place. So we need to up our game, I think. So I think the first thing we have that we didn't have a year ago are the vaccines. So I would ask everyone, either if you had 0, 1, or 2 vaccines, to try to quickly get the next vaccine, because if as a community we can up our community immunity, we hopefully can push that virus a bit down and slow it down out of that rapid exponential growth. And the other thing is, the measures in Scotland is now that if you have a case in the household, that you need to self-isolate as a household. And although I agree, people might not like that, it's the best thing to do. Over the last days, data came from England showing that household transmission of this strain is 3 times as high as from Delta. So that means you can't let this go or take that chances. So it's definitely a measure that hopefully helps to reduce the spread.
So you would argue for slightly tougher measures. Would you also support the vaccination of primary school children now?
Yeah, and there are several countries already that do immunize primary school children, and it's definitely a discussion that we hear too little. The chain is as weak as the weakest link, I would say, from an immunity perspective. And we still have many children that have no protection by vaccination. So we have a safe vaccine. And I think it would be wise to really quickly consider whether parents have the choice to get their children from the age of 5 up immunized. But also the children 12 up that had only 1 vaccine or none at all yet, I would actually advise to go and get that shot, their first or their second, and everybody who already got 1 or 2 shots to get their second or their third. And otherwise, I think we really need to up our game with the measures we already have. Think about masking. I really think everybody should really follow that advice, and in crowded places where you can't keep distance, mask up, not only over the mouth, but also over the nose, and preferably very well-fitting mask. And if it's crowded, you can't keep your distance, you could even consider a higher rate mask, an FFP2 as they call it, or even double mask, because we really anticipate this will help limit the spread.
Just very briefly, Professor Bogart, if I may just ask you very briefly, you may have heard our interview with Steve Baker MP earlier on, and he essentially said that we have to trust people, we have to give people freedom, that the question of restrictions is really a moral one. How does a scientist respond to that?
Yeah, as a scientist and a doctor, I know that people like to have a choice, but also want to be well informed and want to be able to weigh their decisions based on the facts. And I think what we can do is show the fact, show how significant this is, how quickly this can get out of hand, and ask them to really work with us to try to limit the spread. It's not only in the general benefit, but also in people's individual benefit, because we want to celebrate Christmas after all, isn't it?
OK, Professor Bogart, I'm sorry to stop you, but we have to move on. But thank you so much for your time this morning.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
You too. Now, COVID has had a huge impact on the life chances of young people, education, work, family. It means millions have missed out, and it seems those in the north of the country have been particularly affected. A disturbing report by my next guest shows that it could affect those young people throughout their lives, and I'm joined now by Professor Kate Pickett of York University. Good morning, Professor Pickett.
Good morning.
What were you trying to discover with the work that you did here?
Well, what we were trying to do was not so much discover, but synthesize, like put together all of the evidence about how children in the north were disadvantaged compared to their peers in the south and the rest of England before COVID, but also to look at the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on children in the north. So there's not a lot in this report that's brand new. I mean, a lot of us have known much of this evidence before, but it's the first time it's all been put together. And together, it makes a really disturbing picture.
So what are the headlines on that picture? What did putting the evidence together tell you that we ought to be concerned about?
Well, it highlights how disadvantaged children in the north are in terms of their mental health, their physical health, their education, their life chances, even before COVID, and how disproportionately affected by the pandemic they have been. So they've missed more schooling, their mental health has been worse affected, their physical activity levels are lower. And we've also been able to put a cost on this. So we can see that unless we mitigate against that extra damage, that extra impact, we will see a scar across the life chances of those children, and that will affect their lifelong productivity and the productivity of the north of England in general. So if we want to really do the best for our economy, for levelling up, and for individual children, then we need to invest where it's needed most.
So to be clear on this graph that we're seeing, just to make sure I understand it properly, what you're saying is that in lifetime earnings, children at school now can expect to see something like 12,500, a penalty, if you like, because of the COVID.
Exactly.
Okay. You also had some data, I think, about the number of months lost, if you like, in learning advance.
That's right. So children in the north of England experience more restrictions, more months of restrictions than children elsewhere. And that affected their learning. And so we find that they've lost 4 to 5 months more of maths literacy learning than children elsewhere in England. So that's a really big loss.
If you had your way, Kate Pickett, what would you do to help those children catch up? What could
Are you giving me a magic wand? Okay, if you're giving me a magic wand, I would ask the government to put children and families at the heart of the levelling up agenda and target their investment where it's needed the most, to the most deprived areas and to the areas most affected by the pandemic, and to invest in early childhood. And they could do things so easily They could increase child benefit, top up the child aspect of the universal credit, child tax credits, fund family centres even more than they promised to do in the budget. So it's just a matter of directing their investment to the places that need it the most.
Let's stick with the Sky News magic wand for a moment, and you've got it. Last week we were in a town called Goole on the Humber, which is exactly one of the kinds of places that I think people will be talking about when they're talking about levelling up. In practice, what you've just said, how would that make a difference for a family in Goole, which currently maybe somebody's lost their job, where they feel that, in the jargon, they've been left behind? What would they see that would be different, that would help to close this gap that you've described?
Well, we know that all parents want to do the best for their children. And if you're feeling that your children's life chances are being hampered by poverty, by poor schools, by lack of services, that's incredibly stressful. And so I think even small amounts of investment into families' livelihoods can really reduce stress for parents, can really impact things like food security, housing security, enabling families to have the time and the care for their children and to be able to nurture them in the ways that they would most wish to. So fairly small amounts for families can make a big difference. And the kinds of investment that we're asking for, the kinds of recommendations that we're making in this report really could tip the balance between children having the best start in life or children being in families where the chronic stress of poverty is really affecting everybody's life chances and well-being.
The major government player here is the relatively new Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Michael Gove. Have you sent the report to him, and what would be your expectation of his response?
Our report's going to all relevant ministers and MPs. We already know that there's cross-party support for doing something about the recommendations in this report. I would ask him to come and talk to us, and I would ask him to make sure that children and families are at the heart of levelling up.
OK, well, next time he's here with us on Sunday morning, I'll ask him how he responds to all of that. Kate Pickett, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that is as much as we've got time for this morning. It is without doubt going to be a bumpy ride into Christmas for the government and for politics in general. We thought we would not be here next week, but I can tell you, happy days. We will be back next Sunday. In a moment, Sam Coates and The Take.